Norton Disney, which is midway between Lincoln and Newark, and to the Church of St. Peter from the 14th, 15th and 16th century, commemorating the Disney family who were the lords of the manor.
The most famous storyteller in American history once stood inside a stone church older than the United States and stared at his own last name on the wall. It happened in a village of 500 people, in front of a tomb that had been waiting 600 years for him to walk in. The crest above it, 3 lions on a shield, would shape the look of an entertainment empire worth billions. But the real story isn't the crest. It's the 800-year survival run that puts it there. A Norman soldier on a battlefield, an English estate lost to civil war, an Irish farm killed by famine, a man who fled 3 continents to keep his family's name alive. Walt Disney didn't just inherit a brand, he inherited an instinct. And the most famous mouse in history wasn't drawn out of joy, he was drawn out of desperation. To understand the man who built childhood for half the planet, you have to start in the one place most Americans don't even know exists. In 1949, Walt Disney was already a legend. Snow White had broken records. Bambi had broken hearts. Pinocchio had cemented him as the man who taught a generation what wonder looked like. He could have been anywhere on Earth that year. Premieres in Paris, studio meetings in New York, a beach in California with a cigar and his feet up. Instead, he drove out into the English countryside, past hedgerows and country lanes, until he reached a village so small you could walk across it in 10 minutes. The sign at the edge of the road read Norton Disney. 500 people, a handful of houses, a pub, a church, and a name on the village marker that matched the name on every cartoon, every studio gate, every signature he had written for 30 years. That right there is not a coincidence. That's a clue someone left behind for him on purpose. Walt walked into St. Peter's Church. The building was old in a way American churches don't get to be old. Norman stonework, weathered brass, tombs older than entire countries. He stopped, in front of memorials, carrying his last name, Disney, carved deep, lit by colored light coming through the stained glass. For a man who had spent his whole career inventing imaginary worlds, this was something rare, something he hadn't authored. The name on the wall existed before he did. It would exist after him. It had been waiting in this church for almost 600 years before he ever set foot inside. Above one of the tombs was a crest, 3 lions on a shield, heraldry from a time when families needed a symbol because most people couldn't read their own name. Walt didn't just look at it, he absorbed it. You can tell by what he did with it later. Now here's the question nobody asked him that day, the one that opens this entire story. How does an American cartoonist, born in a Chicago apartment, end up with a 600-year-old crest sitting in an English church waiting for him? And why after seeing it, does he barely talk about it for the rest of his life? The answer is that Walt Disney was not the first Disney to find himself standing in a strange place, wondering how his family got there. He was just the first one famous enough that anyone wrote it down. Because that name on the village sign didn't start in England. It didn't even start in the English language. It started in France, with a man who got on a boat in the year 1066 to bet his entire bloodline on a single afternoon. If you think the name Disney was always clean, simple, American, you're looking at the last page of a story that runs 9 centuries deep. The Disneys did not arrive in California by accident. They didn't arrive in Chicago by accident. They didn't even arrive in Norton Disney by accident. Every place that name has ever appeared on a map exists because somewhere up the line, somebody refused to die where they were standing. Walt didn't know all of it that day in the church, but he knew enough. He knew the crest, he knew the tomb, he knew his great-grandfather had crossed an ocean, and he knew that whatever his name was, it was older than anything he had ever built. Most people inherit furniture. Walt Disney inherited an exit strategy. To understand what was actually carved into that stone and why it had been waiting 900 years for him to walk in and see it, you have to go back to a beach in 1066 and meet a man whose name nobody in England could even pronounce. 900 years before Walt Disney walked into that English church, the name carved on its walls didn't exist yet. In 1066, the family wasn't English. They weren't called Disney. They lived in a small coastal town on the Normandy coast called Isigny, and the name they carried, d'Isigny, wasn't really a family name in the way we think of family names today. It was an address. It meant from Isigny, the way somebody today might say the family from down the road. It told other Normans where you were from, who your neighbours were, and roughly how much land you owned. The d'Isigny family wasn't royal. They weren't lords with private armies. They were what historians call minor Norman nobles, small landowners with enough property to feel proud and not enough to feel safe. They were soldiers mostly, the kind of family that survived by being useful to bigger families. Then, in 1066, a bigger family came calling. A duke named William looked across the English Channel and decided he wanted to be a king. He needed soldiers. He needed loyal ones. He needed men who would cross the water with him, charge a beach, and fight an entire English army that was waiting on the cliffs above. That offer was kind of a trap dressed as a promise. Stay home, stay alive, stay small. Or get on a boat and risk losing everything, including the only thing minor nobles really had, which was a name nobody had killed yet. A man named Robert d'Isigny got on the boat. We don't have his face, we don't have his voice. There is no portrait, no signature, no scrap of anything that tells us what he was thinking when he stepped onto that beach. But we know what the Battle of Hastings actually was, and it wasn't a heroic painting. It was hours of terror. Cavalry charges that broke and reformed. Feigned retreats designed to pull the English line apart. Men dying in the mud whilst their friends watched. Robert's job wasn't to look brave. His job was to not break. To stand where William told him to stand. To survive long enough for the plan to work. He survived. That sentence is the entire reason there is a Disney company. If Robert d'Isigny had broken on that battlefield, if he'd panicked or run in the wrong direction, or caught an arrow in the chest, there would be no Mickey Mouse, no Disneyland, no name on a Chicago birth certificate in 1901. Walt Disney exists because 900 years ago, before he was born, a stranger he never knew about decided to hold his nerve. That's not a flourish, that's the math. William won, England fell, and William paid his soldiers the way conquerors always pay soldiers, in stolen land. Robert was given holdings in Lincolnshire, in the English countryside, far from anything he'd ever known. One of those manors took the family name and became Norton Disney, the same village Walt would walk into almost 1,000 years later. But here is the part most Americans never hear. The name didn't survive that long by staying the same. It survived by changing. A name that refuses to change breaks. A name that adapts travels. In Norman French, d'Isigny rolled off the tongue. In an English mouth, it sounded foreign and strange. English clerks couldn't spell it. English neighbours couldn't say it. Generation by generation, it got sanded down. D'Isigny became d'Isigny. D'Isigny became Disney. Disney became finally Disney, the spelling Walt would eventually write at the bottom of every cartoon he ever drew. By 1386, that spelling was already in legal charters. The name had dug in. The family held Norton Disney as minor lords for the next 300 years, leaving tombs in the church and the 3 lion crests carved above them. For a moment, it looked like the running was over. It wasn't, it was just paused, because the same kind of storm that had once given the family England was about to come back around, and this time it was going to take almost everything. For 500 years, the Disneys were what the English call country gentry. Not famous, not powerful, just stubborn. They held Norton Disney through plague and harvest failure, through wars between kings and reformations of the church. They buried their dead in the same stone floor. They added names to the same tombs. They ate from the same fields their grandparents had tilled. 500 years in the same village. Try to actually sit with that for a second. The same dirt, the same church, the same family carving names into the same wall for half a millennium. There is a quiet truth in country history that nobody talks about. You can hold land for centuries and lose it in a season. The 17th century arrived like a wrecking ball. England tore itself apart. King Charles I lost his crown and then lost his head. Oliver Cromwell rose with an army of radicals who wanted to remake the country from scratch. Old aristocracy, old loyalty, old land, none of it was safe anymore. Royalist families got their estates seized. Anyone whose name was tied to the old order suddenly found that the ground beneath them was made of sand. The Disneys saw it coming, and they did exactly what Robert Disney had done 6 centuries earlier. They didn't wait to be crushed. They moved. That is the moment the family pattern becomes undeniable. Twice now, in 2 completely different centuries, in 2 completely different countries, the Disneys made the same call. When the world starts shaking, you don't stand still. You get on a boat. This time, the boat went west across a smaller stretch of water to Ireland. They settled in County Kilkenny. Green fields, grey stone walls, soft rain, and a country that didn't trust newcomers. The Disneys arrived as outsiders in a land where outsiders had to prove they belonged with their hands. The texture of the name changed completely. In England, Disney had been a place. It had been a tomb. It had been 3 lions on a stone shield. In Ireland, Disney became a verb. It meant working a field. It meant counting rent. It meant calluses and cracked knuckles, and the particular kind of tired that only comes with owing somebody money for the dirt under your feet. A family of minor lords had become a family of farmers in a single generation. The crest stayed in England. The struggle came with them. That's not a fall from grace. That's a transformation. The same instincts that made them survive a battlefield in 1066 made them survive a brand new country with a brand new climate and a brand new set of neighbours who were not particularly happy to see them. For about 150 years it worked. The Disneys built up small holdings around the area near Freshford. They married into local families. They had children who had children who had children. By the early 1800s, one branch of the family was farming around 114 acres. Not a fortune, but enough to feel rooted again. The word comfortable in rural history is a dangerous word. It usually means you're about to get hit by something you didn't see coming. By the 1830s, the hit was already in the air. Crops were starting to fail. Yields were dropping. Tenant farmers were sliding into debt. A movement called the Tithe War had erupted across Ireland. Small farmers refusing to pay church taxes that were squeezing them dry. Family members were already advertising land for emergency rent, the way you'd post a desperate notice on a bulletin board today. Word was spreading through Irish parishes that something larger was coming, something hungry, something that wouldn't stop at one bad season. In a small farmhouse near Freshford, a man named Arundel Elias Disney looked at his wife, his young son, his fields and the sky, and started doing the math his ancestors had done in 1066 and 1640. How long until the floor gives out? And how far do we have to go this time? Arundel Elias Disney was born around 1801. By the time he was 30, he had a wife named Maria. a young son named Keppel, and a stretch of Irish land that was getting less productive every year. He didn't have a crystal ball. He didn't know that the Great Famine was about to hit Ireland in 1845 and kill 1 million people. Nobody knew that yet, but he could feel the air change. His brother had already advertised land for immediate rent, a small notice in the paper that said in plain language, "Things are not okay anymore." Crop yields were down, neighbours were leaving, the tithe collectors were getting harder. The sky over Kilkenny was full of small signals that anyone paying attention could read. That's the part of the story that gets me. Arundel wasn't running because he was a coward. He was running because he was paying attention. He was the smartest kind of survivor, the kind who leaves before the disaster, not during it. In 1834, more than a decade before the famine hit, he gathered his family and sailed out of Liverpool on a ship bound for North America. 11 years later, the country he left behind would lose a third of its population to starvation and emigration. The estate his family had farmed for generations would eventually go bankrupt and get sold off in court. The land Arundel walked away from would become one of the most haunted places in 19th century history. He was already gone. That's not luck. That's inheritance. The same instinct Robert Deisne carried onto a beach. The same instinct that pulled the family out of England before Cromwell's army arrived. The same internal alarm that had been telling Disneys for 3 centuries, when the air starts smelling like collapse, do not wait for confirmation. The family landed in New York in October 1834. They didn't stay. New York was already full of immigrants fighting for the same jobs and the same scraps of land. Arundel pushed north into the Canadian frontier, Ontario, near a town called Goderic. He bought 149 acres of forest. He built sawmills. He built gristmills. He turned trees into lumber and lumber into money. While the old Irish estate was bleeding out behind him, the new Canadian one was rising up in the woods. The name had survived another reset. This is where Walt's direct line begins to take shape. Arundel's son Keppel grew up in Canada. Keppel's son Elias, Walt's father, was born in Ontario in 1859, and Elias was born with the migration coded into him. He didn't stay where he was planted. In 1878, he moved the family south into Kansas, chasing the same thing his great-grandfather had chased across the Atlantic: stable ground. He didn't quite find it. Elias was a hard worker who never seemed to land in the right place at the right time. He moved the family from Kansas to Chicago, from Chicago to a farm in Marceline, Missouri, from Marceline to Kansas City, from Kansas City back to Chicago. A young boy named Walter, born in Chicago in 1901, grew up watching his father pack and unpack and pack again. A 7-year-old watching his father move a household for the 3rd time isn't getting a childhood, he's getting an apprenticeship. He saw pennies counted at the kitchen table. He saw the worried looks that come over a man's face when he reads the rent notice. He learned before he was 10 years old that a roof over your head is not a thing you own. It's a thing you fight for every month until you can't anymore. But Walt had something Elias didn't have. Walt could draw. He could build clean little worlds where the rules didn't change and the bad guys always lost. He could escape the kitchen without leaving the kitchen. He could move without moving. It was the family instinct showing up on paper. And when Walt grew up, he did exactly what his ancestors had done. He bet everything on a place he'd never conquered, and then that place tried to bury him. By the early 1920s, Walt was running a small studio in Kansas City. It failed. He didn't go home. He packed a suitcase and got on a train heading west with $40 in his pocket and a half-finished idea in his head. He was running the exact same play Arundel had run in 1834, just with different scenery. He ended up in Hollywood. He built a new studio. He created a character called Oswald the Lucky Rabbit, and for the first time in his life, for the first time in his family's life, in almost 100 years, things actually worked. Oswald was a hit. Money came in. Animators got hired. Walt finally had stability. He had money. He had a successful character. He had the thing his father had spent decades chasing and never quite caught. In 1928, he took a train to New York to renegotiate the contract. He thought he was going to walk out with a better deal. He walked out with nothing. The distributor told him, calmly, that Oswald didn't belong to him. The character was the studio's property. And while Walt had been busy building the next short, the distributor had quietly hired away most of his animators behind his back. Walt was 26 years old. Everything he'd built was gone in a single conversation he couldn't undo. That right there is the moment the family instinct earned its keep. He got on a train back to California. 3 days, 3 nights, the American landscape sliding past the window. He could have panicked. He could have quit. Most people would have. But Walt came from a line of people who had been losing things for 900 years. A Norman estate, an English manor, an Irish farm, a Kansas City studio. The Disneys had a long history of getting up after the floor dropped out. Somewhere on that train ride, he pulled out a notepad and started sketching. He needed something new. He needed something they couldn't take away from him this time, something he owned outright. He drew a mouse. He didn't draw Mickey because he was inspired. He drew Mickey because he was cornered. That is the through line of this entire story. Mickey Mouse is not a character. Mickey Mouse is a deed of ownership the family has been chasing since 1066. He is the answer to a question that had been haunting the Disneys for almost a millennium. How do you survive when the people in power decide they want what you built? You build something they can't reach. Walt made absolutely sure he owned Mickey. Every license, every reproduction, every appearance locked down. The lesson of the lost Lincolnshire estate, the lesson of the Kilkenny farm, the lesson of Oswald the rabbit, all of it compressed into a single legal document. He spent the rest of his life buying land. When he built Disneyland in California, he bought the acres around the park too, because he remembered, somewhere in his bones, that landlords were how families like his lost everything. When he started planning his Florida park, he bought thousands of acres of swamp through shell companies, hiding his name from sellers so the prices wouldn't jump. A man whose great-grandfather had been a tenant farmer in Kilkenny was now buying enough land in Florida to build his own city. That's not a hobby, that's a memory. In 1949, in the middle of all of it, he flew to England and visited Norton Disney. He stood in St. Peter's Church and looked at the 3 lions on the family crest. He didn't just see history. He saw a piece of his own iconography. He took the 3 lions home with him, into the company's design language, the way his ancestors had taken a French name and reshaped it into an English one. Walt didn't talk much about it. He didn't need to. He lived the pattern. Every time you watch a Disney movie, you're watching the survival instinct of a family that lost almost everything, almost every century, and refused to disappear. Walt Disney didn't draw a mouse. He drew a map of how to keep going. And the landing, finally, was permanent.